Hello everyone, today we talk about the evangelization of Anglo-Saxon Britain, really an evergreen in medieval historiography. We dedicated a couple of videos here and there to it, but we still have to tell the whole story, even to some introductory degree. We can start from this by talking essentially about the first missions to England from Rome. So you know that there is all a Gaelic influence before this, and especially in certain parts of Britain, that will end up clashing with the Roman system that will eventually be prevalent in England, in spite of, for example, some Gaelic legacy, like, I don't know, the greater importance of abbeys. Let's speak about Canterbury, that today, of course, we're going to discuss as the cornerstone of the evangelization of England from Kent. Made multiple videos also about especially the southeastern Anglo-Saxon polities of the so-called Epitharchy. We still have actually to cover some of the most important, such as, well, Wessex, arguably the most important, Northumbria as well. We'll get there. These videos I already made a video specifically about the connection between the evangelization of England and the Bretwalda. So how essentially the imperial Anglo-Saxon mentality that was very clearly oriented, in fact, to the control of the entire British Isles since the moment the Anglo-Saxons set foot in Britain, entailed a tendentially unitary direction, right, of recognition of a broader authority over the entire system. We talked about other times, and also from strictly military point of view, the Battle of Brunanburh, the affirmation of a compact English ethos stemming from the compaction, say, of the so-called Epitharchy. But it's important to look at the roots of this. In fact, aside from the general backwardness of the Anglo-Saxons compared to the rest of Romano-Germanic Europe, was not a dysfunctional system, at least given the premises of unavoidable fragmentation of power in such a relatively only superficially Romanized land like Britain, and the very warlike and in fact like primitive culture that this Germanic peoples entail. Like, there was an immediate stabilization of the system around specific cornerstones, including the same Christian church that had already existed in Roman Britain, had witnessed a moment of depression, to say the least, in the moment of the Bodanic invasion, say, of the Anglo-Saxons, that however had not wiped out Christianity, and actually began already from the end of the 6th century to understand, of course, all what the Christianization of the system had to offer in terms of state building, of political power, and beyond. We talked a lot about the Merovingians. We have to talk more about the Gregorian. We're talking about Gregory the Great's papacy. That is one of the greatest moments in the history of the West. People think that Rome ended, right? That these chapters, especially the evangelization of England, shows how Rome was the spiritually hegemonic power in the entire continent. Telling the truth, there was no other center that could boast the same holiness and deeply European continuity in Catholic power since also pre-Christian times. So we will have to talk more about the overwhelming capacity of Rome to keep the Latin Germanic world together, continuously informing it, civilizing it, acculturating it, and allowing it also in the following centuries to boom and to overwhelm the rest of Europe and the Mediterranean. Now, in the 90s of the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great developed a plan for converting England. The stories that he encountered Anglian slave boys in the markets of Rome, and he was struck by their, in fact, angelic, that was Anglian angelic, it was that linguistical gain look that seemed auspicious for in fact, what would be the clamorously successful Christianization of these people. it would be very interesting. I will surely make a video about this to study, like to explain the previous connections that existed between Rome and peoples like the Anglians. Like the story is that these guys came out of nowhere. They had nothing to do with Rome. Like there is an entire and unfortunately dominant chunk of sort of Western historiography that still emphasizes this contrast between Romanity and Germanity, which is probably one of the most celebrated concept ever ideated, and that doesn't take into consideration the fact that, aside from the fact that for these peoples, of course, Rome was the unchallengeable center of the world, regardless of whether they had been ruled by the Romans or not in their previous history, but that these peoples were in Rome since ever, right? Aside from the Anglo-Saxon, that will become, in fact, one of the most important guilds in medieval Rome, but just the other day I made that video about the ancient Germans of Tacitus' description. That, of course, shows you, as we've seen also in those videos, about the Equites Germani corpores custodes, etc., that of course the Germans had always lived in Rome for a very long time and knew perfectly well what the whole thing was about. So that this evangelization of England didn't happen overnight, first of all, but even more importantly was deeply rooted in the Catholically European imperial ethos that all these peoples shared and were especially annihilating to achieve. Right, the axis represented by the Anglo-Saxons, the Merovingians, the Longobards at this point, and the papacy, in a purely Latin Germanic sense, and the axis represented by the metaphysical cornerstone of Rome, which was recognized also by other peoples, including Constantinople, Toledo, is in this sense what will fuel what we see in the following centuries, especially starting from, say, the Carolingian reforms of script, like the further monastic unification of the West and so on. Like the sap of Western superiority that had already been affirmed. I made lots of videos explaining a bit this hard to die myth of the Latin Germanic backwardness, and especially highlighting, among the other things, the heavy barbarization of the Byzantine world by this point. And all the narrative is inherent, the lesser people, fortestater, sort of nation-state, anti-traditional, nationalistic and socialistic, and anti-traditional, anti-Catholic, anti-imperial, anti-European, anti-Indo-European ideology that was developed since the 19th and 20th century, that completely mystified, cancelled, erased, etc., any kind possible traditional meaning revolving around the objective superiority of Western civilization throughout all its historical arc, and that heavily passed or centrally passed through this axis, even as you understand here, beyond the boundaries of the same Carolingian Empire. The Anglo-Saxons are not part of that, but they establish an incredibly strong tie with Rome. Here we're talking about the Anglians, the Saxons, but think about how, also recently made a video about the leaders of the Viking era, how deeply connected Knut the Great of Denmark was with the city of Rome, right, aside from his visit, but the incredibly heavy Catholic legacy that the Anglo-Saxon church provided him in order to be connected with the imperial ethos of the continent at the time, by the way of the Ottonians, of the Salians. And so in a moment in history that was really witnessing the re-blossoming of the great Western civilization. Praising the English church in these times is very easy, so I will try to make lots of videos about that, but also getting very much in depth in how the thing was made and what kind of influences were at work, what kind of projects, what kind of vision and plan, right? In fact, in this time in which allegedly there was no authority in the West whatsoever, which is the other myth that you have been fed regarding the fall of the Western Roman Empire and all this stuff, the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons is one of the greatest successes in the aforementioned superiority of Western civilization. and it had incredibly deep roots. Rome knew the world, and the world knew Rome, and these peoples were just ready for starting on that path that will also lead England very far in history. At that time, Christians were already present, of course, in fact, at the courts of kings like Ethelbert of the Kentish, ruling from around 589 to 616. We'll understand now, well, you know why, especially from a prevalently Anglo-Saxon background as you was, and why he's key here. What is important, we've seen in the video about the Kingdom of Kent, is of course the privileged position that this had in Britain, just the most connected to continental Europe, to the Frankish court, and that was pioneer, in fact, as a medium between the Anglo-Saxons and Rome, the evangelization of the saint. It wasn't just about the Franks, it was about, again, this broader system existing in Italy now, even in countries that were formally Arian still, or like in this case, not essentially nor officially Christianized, right? But that was there, like never be, again, this notion that you have to categoristically and formalistically label and tag everything. This is typically also contemporary American mindset that I don't know how really could ever be associated to any historical idea. But of course you have to look at the spirit, at the pneuma, at the ghost of these peoples and realign what they were heavily unitarily doing and succeeding in doing. So again, in times of incredible material shortcoming, of great exhaustion, right, of also in these places, like really great scarcity of resources, but still wanting it. This is also what is really amazing of all this, how meticulously could Rome organize this evangelization and succeeding in coordinating it at thousands of kilometers away in the 6th, in the 7th century. It's something incredible, and yet for them it was so crucially important. By the way, Kent was the first epitarchic realm to achieve an hegemony, right? To become Bretwalda on Britain initially. Then, of course, things would change. Power would shift at different times from a realm to another. But this was a moment of Kentish leadership to an important degree. Ethelbert, very importantly, had wed Bertha, the daughter of the Merovingian king Charibert, who had brought a bishop named Liudhard from Tours to Britain. Bertha thus initiated Christian worship in Canterbury. Right? Consider these are the same years, same generation, let's say, of Theodolinda, the Bavarian and Catholic Nicaean, right, queen of, at least princess of the Bavarians, that will become queen of the Longobards, marrying first Authari, then Agilulf, that were both Arian, but that, of course, accepted this. That there wasn't really much of any persecution documented anywhere in Longobard Italy. Like the fact of being Arian, especially there, differently from Visigothic Spain, first of all, had nothing to do with any actual thorough, say, theological position being debated or questioned, whatever, against the Catholic world. There was mostly like a political and military situation that required certain peoples to distinguish themselves in a international sense, like being more acting more as mediators, let's say, with, for example, certain parts of still so-called pagan or better pre-Christian Central Europe, and the threat presented by the Byzantine Empire. The Franks had also been aggressive against the Longobards. Now relations would normalize. The Bavarians had been sort of created as a duchy, as you know, by the Franks, and they had inherited, in fact, Clovis' legacy of straight conversion from pre-Christian to fully Catholic beliefs without passing through Arianism, which made an enormous favor to the west, and especially to the Franks. So when you look at this Merovingian connection of a Kentish king like Ethelbert, you immediately realize what the game here is. There are already Christians at his court. He marries a Christian princess, by the way, of such high noble blood. The Romano-Germanic rulers were very aware about their ethnic dynastic commonality. There was a great background of, say, Germanic epos shared among all these peoples and courts. They adopted one another. They performed, like, they really informed that the aforementioned Romano-Germanic identity further in this time of apparent, like, sort of this connection between various countries. Bertha, of course, would marry Ethelbert without renouncing her faith, because that's what the entire political connection and marriage had been about between the two powers. On the contrary, she organizes further the Christian worship in Canterbury, that, as you know, is the spiritual heart of England in this perspective since this early time. Canterbury was also Ethelbert's own capital, right? So it was obviously the privileged center also for this connection, this bridge with continental Europe, with Merovingian, with the tendentially imperial Merovingian power. Bertha used a British church dedicated to Saint Martin of Tours, by the way, because as we've seen, Liudard came from Tours himself, and Saint Martin, as you know, is one of the single most important saints in the history of the West, with a staunchly brutal military background and such an enormous magnitude in terms of especially Gallo-Roman spirit and identity, highlighting the essentially clientelar relation existing between the Merovingians and the Kentish in this case. This is so important because it's such a long story. Like, also in Roman times, this area inhabited by, as you know, the Cantiaci and also other peoples, but that's where the name Kent comes from, had been sort of the most advanced, the most connected with the continent before the Roman conquest of Britain. When you look at the Merovingian world, you realize that its frontier was pretty wide, and many so-called, say, as the broader cauldron of the synecdoche, the Anglo-Saxon peoples also migrated from what was to Britain from what was at the time Merovingian territory, right? The coastline stretching, in fact, from the Jutland to wherever in the west, being controlled by the Franks. Therefore, the strong connection between the Merovingians and Britain being very, very strong. It's as if, like, the later medieval sort of French English at that point, like, of course, after the Norman conquest that had tightened the connection further, etc. But this already existed, right? The more I study history, the more I personally see how basically, like, how Europe was 2,000 years ago, it's today in the essence, in the spirit of peoples, that their interconnection, their shared values and so on. This is incredibly, incredibly important. In 596, Augustine, that was likely an Italian monk, meaning that it was likely born in Italy proper, along with an initial group of missionaries, was dispatched from Rome, so by the Pope, to England, right? Italy was going under a very important era in its spiritual orientation, especially Gregory the Great, that belonged, as you know, to the gens Anicia, one of the most powerful, cultured, educated, ultra-elite dynasties in late Rome, and who was a hell of a jurist, about administrator, organizer, one of the most important people in the entire history of mankind, was genially understanding that in this sort of now exhausted world, in which essentially the late antique system did not work anymore, or at least not like before. Of course, in Italy there was a great urban continuity, etc., but in many ways it was the countryside now that had to be won over, also in a broader moral sense. And there are many, that there is the life of Saint Aquinas, written by the Saint Gregory that there is this necessity, deeply felt, of evangelizing properly the bulk, right, of the endemic pool that constituted these Romano-Germanic countries, that a large lived, in fact, in the countryside, in areas that were distant from the city, also from a cultural and spiritual point of view, and that had their own spiritual background. It could heavily contribute to the Catholic, and would heavily contribute to the Catholic endeavor, right, and cement that much that the robustness of the Latin Germanic civilization, right. So the choice of England in that case is not random, right. It was very scientific. Rome perfectly understood the enormous blend, potential, and combination that Anglo-Saxon Britain represented per se. Also, its Roman legacy. In fact, the status of a Romano-Germanic would historiographically define a Romano-Germanic power in order to tighten this axis that would successfully rival with the East, and actually already at this point being way more spiritually, morally, and culturally expansive than the East, especially from Rome. Without Rome, this could have really not been done, right? It would have been much more complicated. It doesn't even make sense to reason as if that was out of the equation, but the way these peoples were Christianized, of course, could have never been the same hadn't Rome directed this. Like, say, not Rome, of course, not having been in the way because of St. Peter, St. Paul's centrality in Christendom and so on, and so the metaphysical role that the papacy had. Made an entire video about this, but truly, this shows you how efficient, how culturally, civilly advanced, still not just Rome, but the West was and would always remain in this endeavor. The monks sent with Augustine received assistance, by the way, including logistical support, protection, etc., from Gallic bishops at key cities that really represented this string, this chain of cornerstones of Western, of explosive Western spirituality, such as Arles, that had been the prefecture of the Gaul after Trier, was one of the most heavily Romanized cities in the entire empire, we can say. Consider that there is there a great proximity of the same Byzantine presence, right, which, however, here you understand is not really involved, because it was Rome doing so, not really Constantinople telling Rome to do that. And the same goes for Marseille, that is just even there in the very south, on the very coast. Arles is the gateway to the upper Rhone Valley, and so from there properly Francia. These areas, as you know, were still contended between the Burgundians, the Visigoths, and so on. Also in a broader cultural sense, they were separated from what as Occitanian land from the French of the north by the Massif Central and more. Of course, not just to stick to the geographical separation. The same Tours, right, representing there yet another very important chunk of Gallic identity at this point, that is Aquitaine, but also very close. I mean, the Loire and the frontier with Francia proper, that, as we've seen, have produced the same missionaries that were already there escorting Bertha to her new home. These local bishops provided provided the Italian legation with necessities like interpreters for their journey. This is quite relevant and important because it shows, by the way, that there were, of course, people who spoke Anglo-Saxon, spoke Germanic there, not just because of the Franks, but literally because of some broader English connection that we can't fully document, because we really rely on very few evidence, generally speaking, at this point in history, at least compared to previous and posterior times. Actually, we know a freaking lot. We don't know so many details from, say, the Byzantine Empire at this point in their history. We know overwhelmingly more about Latin Germanic Europe. That alone should tell you how sort of, in a sense, overestimated even Byzantine culture is. The missionaries reached Thanet in eastern Kent in 597, so the year after they had left Rome. And in this place, they preached in front of the same Ethelbert and his Gezzets, leading to an invitation to settle in Canterbury. The Gezzets are an important detail here because, as you know, these were a class of elite warriors or companions in the early medieval Anglo-Saxon society. They served as the personal retinue of a lord or king, representing a bond of loyalty and mutual protection in an imperial Catholic sense. I mean, if these rulers wanted to achieve a universal ecumenic power, ideally, and even just on Britain, from the Bretwalda perspective, they were the enforcers of that. So the fact that these would meet with the Roman spiritual delegation and they would be informed by it for like the sacralization of their own power is incredibly relevant. It's not just random. It's the meeting of the regnum and the sacerdotium, the temporal and the spiritual. By 598, Pope Gregory himself reported that already by that point, 10,000 English individuals had converted to Christianity, which at the time, considering the English population at large was between 250 and 500,000, right? It's really a lot, especially considering, of course, that these 10,000 were not just some random people. These conversions would have occurred mostly at a high level status that would have informed also the subjects of essentially these noblemen. Consider that comparatively Italy had, I don't know, at this point like 6 million inhabitants. Well, we're looking at a very, in just a couple of years, not even. This is a clamorous success. This shows you how the country was perfectly ready to be Christianized. It's not like, as you know, Christianization would immediately kick in, would be perfectly homogeneous, whatever, would take time. But essentially throughout the 7th century, made multiple videos on this, like the trend was set and the country by the beginning of the following century was essentially a Christian one. It is unclear if King Ethelbert was among these converts himself at that time, although he had been baptized before his death in 616. We don't know where the latter consecration happened. However, the opening of the Anglo-Saxons, their leadership to Christianization was open, in imitation to also the Merovingian Franks, with blessing, the guidance, the authority of Rome, that was building now a very well organized church in parallel in the country. In fact, during 597 or 598, Augustine himself was consecrated as a bishop, likely by the Gaulish Metropolitan Bishop of Arles, though it's uncertain whether this occurred during his initial journey through Gaul, as suggested by Bede in later times, or during a subsequent visit. What is remarkable in any case is how this episcopal authority would be bestowed on Augustine for England from a Gallic and even more like a Southern Gallic Mediterranean episcopate, like also of such high caliber like the Arles one, right? This shows such, you understand the layer, sort of different national background from which the church was unitarily operating here, right? Art was essentially a Visigothic reality, right? Even after Vouillé, even after the Franks had taken over Aquitaine, this Mediterranean stripe in many ways was very connected to Italy historically, but it was also belonging to the Occitanian world. Then you have Francia proper in the north, which is another system. You have the Longobards in the east here that are not essentially blocking any passage, even though most of these travels would have occurred also through the Tyrrhenian, the Ligurian Sea, These are delicate times, by the way, because there is still war between the Byzantines, the Longobards. Technically, Rome is within the empire and is hostile, or at least there is a deep enmity at some levels of the secular administration of Byzantine Italy against the Longobards. Nevertheless, also later relations between the Church of Rome and the Longobards would normalize also well before the Longobards fully accepted the Nicene Creed, right? Another group of missionaries, including monks and priests, Mellitus, Justus, and Paulinus, was sent from Rome in 601, bringing this time essential items for the new church's ministry, such as liturgical vessels and relics. At the same time, Gregory the Great was outlining a plan for organizing a walled Church of England. As of course, just as for Anglo-Saxon power, it was from the side of the ecclesiastical administration a tendentially hegemonic and provincial, like regional, imperial vision of how to administer the English Church from Rome. The unitarity of it would have simplified things in general, so the capacity of thinking this power, and of course the investment that local temporal authorities would provide to this cause was an enormous engine to promote, to affirm, to consolidate a more robust political and institutional power in the same Britain, in a time in which, as we'll see now, still things were very fragmented. Like England wouldn't properly be born as a unitary reality in centuries. So morally, culturally, ethnically, like it already existed. Actually, I think that this chapter in English history is already telling us in an unequivocally clear way how much more cohesive an overall English identity already was by this point. In any case, the Roman Church heavily contributed to it. Augustine was to receive the pallium as a symbol of his authority, now as the Metropolitan of England, having established his see in London, and consecrate 12 suffragan bishops for the southern region. Canterbury was the metropolitic see, but as you understand, there were other ecclesiastical provinces being created with the gradual evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons and the establishment of different dioceses. A second metropolitan see was to be formed in York, which was a bit of a different world. This was in the plans of Pope Gregory, and it's really important because it sort of reflects the previous Roman provincial system of Britain. And the idea was, in part, like having the papacy manage different metropolitic sees so that they would both consolidate in the competition with one another and wouldn't simply get out of hand, because in this way the Roman authority could make leverage on either one or the other depending on what they could achieve. This is really revealing of the degree of accessibility and this possibility that the Anglo-Saxon Church was showing and allowing. The capacity to think so politically and strategically for such Northern European region from Rome is definitely part of the Roman legacy in the region and the broader Catholic view of the world. The metropolitic see of York would operate independently of London following Augustine's passing. It would also have 12 suffragans. It's interesting that, of course, Augustine would maintain such central power, right, given his undebatable charisma and authority in the picture. Of course, this plan, the establishment of these two metropolitic sees, especially the one in the north, would not happen at this moment, and was also likely not practically achievable in this moment in history. Nevertheless, the papal mission did achieve notable successes in, again, a very short term. Emulating Rome, Augustine founded a cathedral church in Canterbury dedicated to the Holy Savior and established an extramural burial church for Saints Peter and Paul. All right, so one church dedicated to Christ within the capital of the Kentish realm. And just like in Rome, the early basilicas were outside, and of course the center, the one that would remain central in Rome, were essentially outside the walls. That was the same for St. John, like all the most important churches in Western Christendom. This had in itself also the typically Roman mindset that had witnessed during the empire the Roman colonies being established in identical emulation to Rome, right? The establishment of a temple to Jupiter, the Curia, the Forum, even the smallest cities in the town and rocks somewhere in the desert in Algeria would be a mini copy of Rome, right? And the same was inherited here by the church and also the secular organizers of the same, in fact the temporal guarantors of its protection in the same identical way. The Roman legacy here is key, is everything. The Anglo-Saxons were fully accepting that, at least to the extent, of course, this was beginning in Kent, and again, there would be a lot of battles before, literally battles, before Christianity took over completely. But again, the overall scenario was ready for this early affirmation to just be unchanged. Augustine ordained Mellitus and Justus as his first suffragan bishops, assigning Mellitus to the East Saxons and Justus to oversee western Kent. These territories were quite composite, and it was difficult for the same local rulers just to unitarily control them. So the church was a very valid auxilium to it, but also reflected the same provincial local subdivisions. The East Saxon king, that was also Ethelbert's nephew, quickly followed his overlord's example and established a see in London in 604. This is relevant because, aside from the fact that London is of course close to Canterbury and the space is not that much, but of course the fact that the evangelization of England would start from, of course, neighboring also countries of Kent that exercise a control de facto on them, especially such close ones, is part of the entire system. We will talk more about medieval London at a point. We talk about Paris, we talk about other cities, but we miss that, and that's so crucial instead. In spite of this expansion, after the deaths of Ethelbert in 616 and his nephew Sebert of Essex shortly thereafter, there was a backlash against Christianity. Ethelbert's and Sebert's successors were pagans, prompting Mellitus and Justus to flee to Gaul. This was a first setback that, however, would not alter the fundamentals of the Anglo-Saxon church accomplishment at this point. In fact, especially in Kent, as it was predictable, of course, the backlash was short-lived. Essex did remain without a bishop until the mid-7th century, which is significant, but it's not like, of course, there wasn't an organized church in loco. Anglo-Saxon history is a bit like this, like there is the first king that converts, he dies or is killed specifically by the pagan establishment. However, after mostly the next pagan king is killed in turn by the Christian guy, and there is Christianity for good ever since. But this early stage is fascinating because it shows you how sort of difficult the whole thing had been regardless of the extraordinary success. Meanwhile, the missionaries achieved significant success, in fact, by converting Edwin of Northumbria after his marriage to Ethelbert's daughter Ethelbert in 625. This is such an important moment in English history. Edwin's choice to embrace Christianity was made after discussions with his chief counselors and eldermen. And there is all a story here. According to Bede, the king's pivotal decision followed a dramatic incident where the pagan priest Coife ruined and set fire to the precinct and idols of the significant shrine at Godmanham in 627. Subsequently, the king, alongside his sons, nobles, and many commoners, was baptized at York in the same year. The more concrete reason why this may have happened, aside from these incidents that may have actually occurred, regardless of how they would have been narrated, remembered, etc., is, of course, like that aforementioned jealousy towards the current Bretwalda, or at least those who could claim such a control over, at least ideally, but also substantially to a certain degree over all of Britain, not just the Anglo-Saxons, by the way, because of course the Anglo-Saxons, regardless of this infight, thought that they were inherently superior to the Celts, to the Romano-Germanic. We made a video about the Arthurian age, like those, also especially from a military point of view, the army's organizations, etc. But there was, throughout all this time, a relentless fight scattered across Britain between these factions and the Celts that kept infesting the Anglo-Saxon part of Britain that was objectively the most developed, the most Romanized, the ones, in fact, in which the stronger would set root and allow for that Christianization. The conversion of Edwin of Northumbria is also significant because it shows you how distance here doesn't quite matter more than much. Like, there was an overarching political reason for which even among the northernmost and biggest powers in the heptarchy of the time, and also like the other actually hundreds of chiefdoms that we can't properly even count, had, in order to hopefully take over the whole system in an imperial fashion. This was also inspired to Rome, as the same also Church of England was mirroring in that sort of broader regional metropolitic ambition of organization. Quite relevantly, further mass conversions occurred in Bernicia, that, as you know, was one of the most sort of fringe areas of the northern Anglo-Saxon world, essentially at the fringe, also the same Celtic fringe. We're talking essentially north of Yorkshire, proving that the usual dynamic, like it's just like the fringe is more resisting to the Orthodox sort of Catholic center, doesn't quite apply here. And the reason, in my opinion, is that, as you understand here, there was a fierce competition, not just locally, between who, say, could, for example, access church power, so to say, and who could instead maintain a different alignment just circumstantially because he had not had the opportunity, for example, to receive these missions, and now found themselves against those who had, in a way, but also because there was, again, an overarching Anglo-Saxon imperial vision by which, like, if you became at this point this quite fragmented and therefore relatively homogeneous in the various elements region, you could rise temporarily as Bretwalda, as backed also by the church. Naturally, there are sort of lots of other smaller dynamics in here, but you realize, for example, that the king of Bernicia, this palace at Yevering, displayed this conversion. The same happened in Lindsay and Lincoln. So there was a veritably public show of such consecration, by the way, because considered in all of this, we don't have time to digress, but the Christian baptism was adding to a degree of sacrality. It was already present in a way in Germanic mythology. I mean, the myth of the waters, this was think about think about even the Merovingian dynasty is itself taking the name after Merowick. That would have been a sea cow of some sort, and it's just like Romulus and Remus floating down the river, all this kind of stuff that we will understand better when talking about the meaning of say the holy kings also not just in the late but in the early Germanic, as far as we can understand from those times view of power in the monarchy. Paulinus was later consecrated as the Bishop of York by Justus, the third successor of Augustine. The initial achievements of the Northumbrian kingdom were not sustained. Following Edwin's defeat at Hatfield in 633, the kingdom disintegrated, also because it was pretty big, and its leaders renounced their faith. So again, the same dynamic we highlighted before. It's not like, however, these lands would abandon Christianity, nor like they would remain pagan on the long run. The Battle of Hatfield is interesting. A minimal digression I would point out. This is also known as the Battle of Hatfield Chase. It was fought on October the 12th, 633, near Doncaster in what is now South Yorkshire. This pivotal battle pitted the Northumbrian forces led by King Edwin against an alliance of the kingdoms of Gwynedd and Mercia. So you understand, an Anglo-Celtic alliance commanded by Cadwallon of Ap Cadfain of Gwynedd, and butchering, of course, the Welsh there, and Pend of Mercia. King Edwin, known for being one of the most powerful rulers in Britain at the time, that's why he had aspired to that Bretwalda status as backed by a Catholic power, was defeated and killed in this battle, which resulted in the temporary collapse of Northumbria. The battle's location has been debated. This is now not so important. But it's one of those contexts where you could see and think like crosses together with Odin's crows left by the fallen warriors, even the same individual ones, having both symbols on the same battlefield like others in Britain at the time. Oswald, a Christian and Edwin's successor, aimed to revitalize the Church of Northumbria, which also mirrors the aspirationally continuative ambition. Right? Instead of turning to Canterbury, Oswald sought guidance from the Dalriadic Irish monastery of Iona. You know, the Dalriada was essentially this Gaelic power straddling Ireland and today's southwestern Scotland. Those from Ireland were the Scots would gradually Scoticized, what had been Pictland up to that point. Iona had been such a major launchpad for the conversion actually of the Celts, because in all this, you know that the Celtic fringe, the Irish, that had not been formally under direct Roman rule in previous times, but also what would become Scotland, through also this very process of evangelization, had an earlier connection with Rome, had Christianized before, also because the Anglo-Saxons were initially not Christian, and so they posed like a sort of more unifying threat for the Celts as far as their fate also was. There were lots of Romano-Brittonic leaders that at the time of the Anglo-Saxon invasions left the richer southeastern England and moved west. I made a video years ago showing that, for example, from an archaeological point of view, we have this shift like of finding crosses and stuff all like in southeastern Britain in Roman times, and then the Anglo-Saxons arrived, and while in the west it was more savage and more pagan, there hadn't been crosses before. Now you find crosses there only, and not any other dating to, in fact, that period at least, the pagan interregnum, so to say, under the Anglo-Saxons in the southeast, right? And in fact, it's very meaningful for a Northumbrian ruler just to connect with the closer, let's say, Christian source there that was in part, as we'll understand now, also in competition with Rome, at least in the way the ecclesiastical administration was conceived, given that Ireland, as you know, did not have cities, had not thus developed what was by that point the universal, in fact the Catholic, Christian, Roman say, diocese system centered in cities, etc., and had attributed to the monasteries, diocesan power. Right, those were the bishoprics, and that's also how initially, like, this Anglo-Saxon conversion had taken so much from that Celtic model, given again to abbeys, rather than specific, urban centers at times. Of course, there were urban centers in Anglo-Saxon Britain, differently from Ireland, but still in this relatively more decentralized way because of that influence. And this would remain, in fact, also in today's English church as a legacy of those times. And by the way, Iona had been the place where the same Oswald had found refuge during Edwin's reign. That, given that here there is all this nobiliar interplay for which they were killing one another, exiling each other, and so on. So, with a renewed sense of mission, Oswald, that, as you know, would become a saint, endeavored to restore Christianity in Northumbria after this backlash that in part he had contributed, like at least in a political sense, to produce. The disintegration of the Roman mission in Northumbria, that, let's remember, it was connected with the papal ideal of establishing a metropolitic seat in York, signified the conclusion of the first phase of English conversion. In the mid-7th century, the Ionian monks took the lead in this endeavor. Under the leadership of Aidan, they established their mission not in Deir and York, but in the Bernician community of Lindisfarne on the North Sea, so from the other side. And so, in the sense, in a more Anglo-Saxon sense, which features prominently in Bede's historical writings. As you know, Bede portrayed, in fact, Lindisfarne as an exemplary monastery, the veritable reflection of the heavenly Jerusalem on earth, which was what essentially the monastery had to be in terms of sacred space, organized according to higher spiritual principles, reflecting the ideals advocated by the same Gregory the Great, thus aligning with the actually Roman model. He noted that the clergy and priests of Lindisfarne lived modestly, and driven by a zeal for evangelism, ventured into the countryside to share their message with the local populace, so fully in line with what we know being, as I was saying before, the spiritual ethos of Gregory the Great. It was essentially evangelizing to an extent, or re-evangelizing the same Italic interland that, albeit being formally Christian from a very old date, was still maintaining a lot of, in fact, truly pagan in that sense, rather than pre-Christian beliefs. You know what's the difference? Christian and pre-Christian does not tell anything about, per se, as Catholic or pagan. Pagan is something that existed under the Catholic religion before Christianity, and that, however, had not fully spread among the masses, because these were normally the plebs, the rural serfs, and nobody objectively cared what they believed in. In fact, the same evangelization of Europe really shows this, that as long as the elites converted, everything was fine, because there was no, say, heretical threat from the masses in this time in history. And as we explained also in other videos, for example, the one about the Frisian religion, the Catholic drive was very strong among the same Vodanic religion, which is the same Indo-European one that Rome had always had and was continuing within Christianity. And again, most people have absolutely no idea what this even means, which is really a pity. People, unfortunately, do not study history of religion and are completely sort of severed from the traditional meaning of this all. But this is exactly what you can see manifesting in this context. Through the efforts of Aidan and his successors, a robust monastic form of Christianity took root in Northumbria, with support from the Northumbrian Bretwaldes that had finally, in fact, achieved the title, and which, interestingly enough, was also introduced to Wessex during the 40s of the 7th century, and to Mercia and Essex in the 50s of the 7th century. This tells you how sort of weird, like, the circles can be. Again, the Celts Christianizing, even before, outside of the Roman Empire, not along the Roman model as we've seen, but of course directed by Rome, and spreading this model in the Anglo-Saxon world from the north right? Because the initial papal mission in the southeast was now proceeding with just at a certain speed. These guys from Northumbria, it was one of the least developed areas of Britain, Anglo-Saxon Britain, spread this first to Wessex and then to Mercia. And Mercia, as you know, is in between the two, so it's so eminently political. There is nothing geographical in this, and that's also geopolitics is BS. It's a pile of BS, especially when you see this kind of fragmented realities. And you realize that by the mid-7th century, there is a substantial and fundamental Christianization of the establishment, as well with, of course, a great deal of evangelization of the populace. There are backs and forths in all this. We are in the 7th century. It's literally the toughest one in the Middle Ages, and there is a devastating plague, likely like the a regional reboot of the Justinian pandemic that struck England in the 60s. This significantly affected the church, like it sort of halted, like less resources, and more sort of disconnection from the previous elan, the previous generation, that also claimed the lives of important bishops like Deusdedit of Canterbury and Tuda of Northumbria, so from south to north in this case, respectively, really showing there's something ominously wrong, like about why is God killing these bishops. Of course, there is all an incredibly fascinating background to this that we were exemplifying before, that is to say these Christian kings and these Christian bishops at large were people, were locals, aside from, as we've seen, the Italian mission. Now we'll see also Theodore of Tarsus, etc. These were Anglo-Saxons had partially converted. This is a dynamic we've seen also in Scandinavia, that many saints, especially of these kings, would fall in combat and therefore become martyrs, because as namely Christians they were fighting against namely sort of pre-Christians, rose to a level of legendary identity that was very important to foster also the local one, but were themselves people of that share the same Vodanic values as before, that again are overall compatible in an informal way with what the entire imperial Catholic tradition had always been, but that in fact were still sort of inferior in between, even from a strictly cultural point of view. It's not like these guys were Christian one day, say so-called pagan, or at least Vodanic one day. Never confuse paganism with Vodanism in that sense. Vodanism was a Catholic religion. Paganism was the lesser people, fourth estate, anti-imperial, anti-traditional mindset. But it's not like they were not Christian, then a day they convert to Christianity, they're exclusively Christian, and everything they did before they didn't. That was completely overlappable, all right? Just the whole thing happened in context in which the same bishops had a lot of power. They came from aristocratic families, were naturally also pretty militarized, warlike ones. So we'll talk more about that, because Anglo-Saxon society is one of the most fascinating in absolute terms in the early Middle Ages. And you understand the power that such bishops wielded at the point. The jurisdiction of Deusdedit, for example, likely extended mainly across Kent, and that again was that relevant still at this point. And the disruption caused by Paulinus' expulsion from Northumbria led to challenges in ecclesiastical discipline and practice. Controlling the church meant to control pretty sizable estates, also fortified areas. Think about the minsters, areas that were really just the same basis of power that you would find also among the lay aristocracy, so to say. These are secular clergymen, by the way, so they also can technically lead warriors to battle. At Samaria, we've seen it also in much later times all across all of Europe. Curiously, not too much about in England. In later times, at least, Richard of Cornwall complaining to his brother when he came back from Germany in the 13th century, saying there are so many warrior bishops there, like we should have them in England as well. But still, it existed in the DNA of these peoples. By the way, I made a video that talks about the essentially chivalric nature of the Thanes, like of the Anglo-Saxon soldiery, right, in a knightly sense, regardless of the allegedly scarce use of cavalry, of mounted troops by the Anglo-Saxons, which has been a bit too overstated in many ways. We'll come back on this. The Ionan missionaries in all this were sticking to distinct Irish customs. They were notoriously also incredibly rigid, austere, severe, and brutal, to the point of torture, actually. And that, in fact, expressed a great deal of the transposed, really, that aforementioned, say, the military mentality that also the Gaels, of course, had. I made a video about the Fiannas, about Gaelic warriors at this time, into that kind of sublimating spiritual experience that Christianity was primarily recalling to. And so that same level of torture, of near, say, death experiences, that was transposed in this monastic lifestyle, because monastic it is, even if these monasteries are essentially diocesan in nature. They wield that level of power. They're different from the Roman model that the Anglo-Saxons at large have adopted. There was a lot about appearance as well, differing between these figures, such as Tonsor, notably in determining the date of Easter. Throughout all the 7th century was a massive controversy. I made a video about this, the Irish Easter controversy, that was an issue with Rome. By now, England, as I understand, is becoming more aligned with the papacy, so historically it will have literally the lion's share in Britain and beyond. It will hold sway in Ireland later on, but in general, as the upper power, it still can't, of course, control so far, and literally the popes have just delegations to cope with the Irish Church, that also in that case, as we've seen, was entailing a continuous competition between this bishoprics / monasteries. I made a video also about that during the same period. Armagh, and there were ferocious struggles. Like, they entail also military retinues clashing against one another. They reflected the normal Gaelic background. That was one of the most traumatically savage that you can imagine in the entire history of mankind at that point. The discrepancy between the Anglo-Saxon and the Celtic church meant that the Irish, for example, sometimes celebrated key church feasts at different times than Roman mission in Kent. This is important because, as we've seen, the Northumbrian court had adopted some aspect, at least, of the Dalriadic system that was coming from, in fact, the overall Irish one, regardless of its own differences. This would bring to some issues during the reign of Oswiu of Northumbria. We're talking 655 to 670. At this point, the king's wife, who was Kentish, observed the Roman practices. So, of course, you would have this strange, like as we were saying before with Theodolinda in Pavia, with a Longobard Arian husbands. She would still coexist, of course, with them without any issue. She would actually write with the papacy. This is the same moment in which the same Anglo-Saxon and Celtic missions were coming to Rome, also passing through the Longobard territory, and this kings allowing the Catholics, of course, to found monasteries to prove that was nothing of that nonsense that people keep repeating without any shame, and generations of historiography having completely debunked regarding the alleged persecution of the Arians. People do not know anything about Longobard history, also because it requires an actual education, which of course is far beyond the average person. In any case, all these matters, of course, seemed very important at the time. It was a way to criticize one another. Like Bede, for example, was an expert in the Computus and exegesis, so that he cared very much about the calendar's exact dates, like to determine the festivals in the exact time of the year, because it was like a reflective of a cosmic order that had to be matched by the faithful. Biblical exegesis was, of course, very important. Those same informations were derived from an attempted reading of the Bible and all the kind of literature that existed, including the one that had been used, that is unfortunately lost, like by the Anglo-Saxon, say the Roman mission to convert the Anglo-Saxon, and so there is so much at stake in this. Computus and exegesis were addressed, for example, at the Synod of Whitby in 664, showing that the Anglo-Saxons at large cared very much about this all, and were aware of the threat really that could be posed by the Gaelic influence and or by just other Anglo-Saxon factions that would tendentially follow that the tradition for the homogeneity, like and the same fitness, the unity of especially the Anglo-Saxon Church. The Synod of Whitby is very important. It was organized and chaired by the same King Oswiu, that, as we've seen, had issues in his own Northumbrian court. It featured Bishop Agilbert and his protege Wilfrid, that were advocating for the Roman approach, while Bishop Coleman of Lindisfarne and Abbess Hild of Whitby defended the Ionan tradition, regardless, as we've seen, of the fact that Lindisfarne had been tendentially more leaning towards the Roman one, but at this point it was a political issue. It was one of power that could be wielded through the organization of the church in a way or another, and mostly by someone or another, and as the matter had to be settled exactly on such occasion. In fact, reason prevailed, as Oswiu himself, that had followed initially the Ionan tradition, ultimately sided with his wife's, that is, Roman faction, leading to Coleman's departure from Northumbria, along with his dissenting monks. You understand how this was compulsive, how it was enforced, like you literally you exiled these people in quite a brutal, like, physical fashion, just as you would expel political opponents and people that could cause trouble within the system. The Synod of Whitby, as you understand, contributed to the homogenization of the Anglo-Saxon church administration. Wilfrid, that, as we've seen, was the strong proponent of the Roman customs, assumed himself the Northumbrian bishopric as a consequence after Tuda, that had been Coleman's successor. Tuda had died just on the same year, which seemed yet another divine green light for saying that, of course, the Roman side was right. However, this appointment was not so straightforwardly smooth, but contentious instead. In fact, during Wilfrid's extended absence in Gaul, where he sought consecration, Sia, that is Chad, a Lindisfarne-trained cleric who accepted the outcome of Whitby, was installed in the bishopric. So you have some different factions even within the apparently pro-Roman side. Consider that this Lindisfarne, as we've seen, had been also a hotbed of those more Dalriadic views. However, there is at stake also a lot of individual power, like as we've seen, the same Northumbrian King Oswiu had issues because of this. So it's not like he particularly, by accepting the Roman side, necessarily had liked Wilfrid. Upon Wilfrid's return around 665, the conflict would in fact remain unresolved for several years. There were these two groups that kept struggling over the control over this major kingdom. As you know, Northumbria, again, we have to talk about it in a video specifically dedicated to it, but it was one of the most powerful polities in the Heptarchy, also inspiring to the Bretwald. Northumbria was thus creating a pretty dangerous situation, right? A critical juncture in the development of the English Church. We can't say that a schism could have simply happened in a formal or even intentional way, but of course the competing claims of the Ionan and Roman missions were a problem that could fracture further like the entire sort of Anglo-Saxon church. Of course, the Roman mission won in the broader way that civilization, just order, the truly orthodox system would triumph in the most practical, intelligent, and obvious sense. Yet this shows also the resistance, the kind of attitude, especially from the Ionan side, in this pernicious way of mostly like individualistic and mostly short-sighted provincial attitude that was just trying to exploit a in fact, Catholic view of the world, but just a more locally factional one. The Synod of Whitby was crucial in this because it essentially, regardless of what happened later and in spite of the effective divisions that persisted, would be formally recognized as the ultimate decision, right? It represented a watershed event in the history of the English Church. It heralded a new era of Christian observance and discipline that would effectively stabilize the English Church as one of the most important in Western Europe. There is yet another phase in the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons, beginning in 669, after the death of the bishop-elect of Canterbury in Rome. As we've seen before also with Fred in Gaul, this other important, not just spiritual but also temporal figures going to die in Rome. It was typical of the Anglo-Saxon nobility, making a testament, going to Rome and die. Like it's blending like throughout the later centuries of such stories, because of course Rome did represent the only possible center of the universe well before Christianization, also for these people. And it's extraordinary really to think how well connected England, thanks to its Roman past, but not only was to the Arabs at this point in history. After the death of the Bishop of Canterbury, the Pope appointed himself an elderly Greek and Syrian in origin speaking monk named Theodore of Tarsus as his successor. This is very important because these are the years of the Islamic invasions in the Levant, and many Byzantines that do not accept the Muslim yoke and especially do not agree with the local establishment essentially opening the gate to the Arabs just to escape the Constantinopolitan heavy taxation, do not in fact go over to Constantinople, but they go over to Rome because they recognize this as a much better place where to continue their work. It's a bit like, I don't know, in the Renaissance when the Turks took over Constantinople and all those Greek humanists came to Italy, also contributing to the further spread of say the classical revival, philology, and Greek studies at large. This tells you further the essentially Catholic nature of the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. It's not a provincial dynamic. It's part of a broader world there that still feels to be revolving uniquely around Romanity. This The Syrians, by the way, were very highly learned at the time. Like, Syria was very advanced, and it had produced historically a great deal of scholars since Hellenistic times. This papal choice was relatively surprising because there could be a cultural divide, difficult to gap between some of the most sophisticated sort of Byzantine Hellenistic in legacy Levantine scholars and the particular spiritual and so dark and military spiritual vibrancy of the Anglo-Saxons. Instead, this connubium was extremely successful. So yet another very successful. These were after Gregory the Great has passed, but Rome has this again deep centrality also in the understanding of what is best in terms, especially of individual leadership for this or that mission. Again, here we will talk about the evangelization of Germany, or what was happening with the Franks in Gaul, with the Longobards in Italy, and the continuous and capillary control and information that the papacy had and disposed of in the evangelization of the continent that was fully succeeding by this time. The same can be said, in fact, for England. By 679, Theodore of Tarsus had stopped referring to himself as the Metropolitan Bishop of Canterbury by taking on the title of Archbishop of Britain instead. You understand the epoch-making title. Here, the St. Gregorian vision of two metropolitic sees had been bypassed, had been surpassed, and a unique Church of Britain. Remember, Bretwalda here, it's not just the English, it's the idea that from England, the entire British archipelago is controlled, highlighting the same intention for the establishment of a essentially unified ecclesiastical administration in the region. Theodore also promoted the reverence of Gregory the Great, that of course was not forgotten. He had been the apostle of the English, even though he had never gone over to England, but with Augustine, with the Roman mission, had really started it all, and it had been just thanks to him in this incredibly reverent past of Roman greatness. Gregory again had been the last potent breath of the late antique church, right? And now Romanity was also adapting to a more exquisitely Italic dimension, also in the wake of Gregory's long-sightedness and providence. Importantly enough, the monastery of Whitby was celebrated by obtaining the burial of Paulinus' patron, Edwin, signifying the centrality of this foundation for the settlement of a united British church. It's meaningful that still a monastery would be celebrated in this tendentially Dalriadic fashion, but now in a way that was fully framed within a Roman form of organization, and of course also Theodore of Tarsus fully embraced. I mean, just the Celtic fringe was the only one to follow this sort of monastic episcopal connubium. The entirety of the empire, everywhere Christianity was allowed, like in an organized form, was of course according to the Roman model. Also, it was the most obvious, the most functional, the most the one we've seen also very often in the Carolingian Empire, but that existed since the beginning of the church in all what had been effectively this vast post-Roman world that was also the most advanced of the entire Western Eurasia. Interestingly, Theodore utilized Gregory the Great's memory and prominence to challenge the same current pope's intention of establishing two independent metropolitan sees. promoting the idea, in fact, of a unified, self-governing church that represented the entire English people under a single leader. And this, again, is fundamentally the most important aspect of it all. Additionally, Theodore aimed to break up the larger English dioceses, which had previously operated with 1 or 2 bishops in each major kingdom or province. This was made possible, first of all, because after the plague, only 2 bishops with excellent credentials remained across the English territories. Therefore, it was easier to sort of divide and rule. The system, as we've seen, had received an important blow. These were young dioceses in the far north of Europe, so they were relatively shaky in terms of political and territorial consistency. And Theodore understood that in order to create a more unified English church, paradoxically, it was important to reinforce the fundamental connection with the papacy and of some sort of central authority in the most also Romanly obedient areas, and parcel the entire system into smaller dioceses, so that there could be a greater dialogue within the same England. It would be, first of all, more dioceses, like more episcopal authority at a local level that could counter the ambitions of more powerful clergymen, as we've seen before, that were very involved in political affairs. More dioceses means more powerful councils that can also counter the abuses of the temporal authority. You don't have just one bishop, or 2 that operate for entities as large as Northumbria, that therefore can weaponize the church in a much more directly effective way, just having like their guy at the head of it. This initiative, unsurprisingly, sparked conflict with Saint Wilfrid, that as we've seen, had been quite active in defending the Roman faction, and had even previously been endorsed by the Saint Theodore of Tarsus for the very important Northumbrian see, in the moment in which the Syrian prelate had arrived in England. And this documents, in fact, how strong the power struggle was within the same within the church in general, within even the same Roman faction. Wilfrid was so powerful, a major figure in the church at this time, regardless of his local issues. He was also a learned man, of course. He was a patron of the arts, a friend of the royalty, as we've seen, and the founder of a network of monasteries stretching from Bernicia in the north to Mercia in the south. So pretty wide area, we're talking hundreds of kilometers, with Northumbria in between, of course, and even down to Sussex in the south, thus exemplifying the best connection there with with his northern origin, but also the connection with the richer Saxon south, that we've seen was more historically connected with the Merovingian world and with the heart of the Roman faction. Wilfrid was influenced by concepts of episcopal grandeur that in fact had stemmed directly from his early experiences in Gaul. The Merovingians really had a hell of an ecclesiastical organization, where in general just more powerful. Gaul had followed different destinies from, say, Italy and Britain, in as much as the concentration of large estates in the hands of very few, and also clergymen, was concerned. The Gallo-Roman episcopate was in great many ways the successor of the senatorial families, the times of the empire. The same, as we've seen, was the case for Rome. For other areas where that sort of late antique picture still continued, but in particular the Longobardi invasion, Italy had also fragmented the estates, had redistributed them in a more even way. The same was for England, even though in a bit more of a disastrous fashion that predated the same Anglo-Saxon invasion. So Wilfrid had an idea of that very strongly aristocratic sense of magnificence, also the vast property of the church, which in England was not really replicable, and that he, however, had been struggling and in part succeeding in establishing, at least thanks to these foundations, that, let's remember it, were essentially territorial lordships of some sort. It's a very different landscape, naturally, than the idea of seigneurial power existing among the Franks, but it's not even too far orientatively. As Bishop of York, that, as you know, was also one of the most important post-Roman cities in Britain, it had been a barracum, it had controlled a great deal of, the Celtic frontier, the Midlands, etc. He had claimed this diocese as the center of probably the Northumbrian ecclesiastical administration, as it had been, as we've seen, in the same intentions of directionally of Gregory the Great. What Theodore of Tarsus was doing now was challenging this notion. Wilfrid had reached the height of his influence in the 70s of the 7th century. He had received the support of Queen Ethelthryth, who backed his establishment of the significant monastery at Exham. However, he had fallen out of grace when a clash with King Ecgfrith of Northumbria in 678 brought to his expulsion from the country, in accordance essentially with Theodore of Tarsus, that at least exploited this opportunity and split the Northumbrian diocese, unitary diocese, as Wilfrid had envisaged and structured it from York, into three, right? This, in a sense, could help also royal authority, because a stronger, more organized church could be useful also in other ways. And in this case, at least, Wilfrid had been openly against the king, considering how much power he was wielding as bishop of Northumbria, metropolitan, you could argue, of Northumbria in his view. Wilfrid did not back down. He was not a man of that kind. He, on the contrary, opposed this decision fiercely. He went to the same pope in Rome, seeking his backing to reverse the situation. Wilfrid was even briefly imprisoned in Northumbria, after which he came back to the south to convert some polities that, for different reasons, were even still yet to, or at least had temporarily abandoned also Christianity in a formal sense. We're talking about the Kingdom of Sussex, the Isle of Wight. Lots of things were actually going on. It would contextualize that. I made a video about the Kingdom of Sussex, so you can check that out. And in the Isle of Wight, Wilfrid became caught up in the Western Saxon King Sidvalla's violent conquest. In fact, this ruler was basically to destroy Jutish power that had been installed in the Isle of Wight, and that was even though, of course, a relatively small center, quite strategically relevant also for the connection with the continent, and in fact the maintenance of a strictly Jutish independence and control of the coastal traffics there. So that it was incredibly violent. Like, Sidvalla was not endowed with a particularly high sense of of mercy and human sensitivity, but these are also the fierce feuds that are continuing among the Anglo-Saxons that do involve the religious policy as well. After Ecgfrith's death, Theodore aimed to restore peace by collaborating with the Mercian king Ethelred and Ecgfrith's sister Elfled of Whitby. As you understand, was connected not just with the royalty, but with the important monastic center that had sanctioned the unity of the Romanity of the Anglo-Saxon Church. A settlement was finally reached with Egfrid's successor Alfred in 686, which brought to Wilfrid's reinstatement to, however, a diminished position in York. Wilfrid was a man, again, of great intelligence, of great soul. He was magnanimous in the original sense of the word, but he fundamentally lost this game, together with some ambitions of further autonomization and provincialization. Let's remember, this guy had fought, as we've seen, against the Celtic orientation of the Anglo-Saxon Church, avoiding provincialization of the same, but at the same time had hoped for establishing a provincial power in Northumbria that would fundamentally act as not as a separate church, but definitely as another head in this Anglian territory, essentially against the Saxon South. These peoples were sort of different and self-aware of the respective identities, even within what we call the broader Anglo-Saxon, you can say English identity that was yet to be formed in the mean we conventionally use it, but that, especially in its British dimension, was now fundamentally accomplished. But this division would remain, and Northumbria, as you know, at large will be a bit allergic to especially the later Saxon hegemony. Nonetheless, Wilfrid continued to push for the complete restoration of his see. He didn't give up even at that point. In 690, as a consequence, was again expelled from Northumbria, seeking refuge at this point with Ethelred of Mercia. His lengthy and turbulent career, which included a second appeal to Rome to settle once again the matter, at least to restore it, in 703, ended with his death as at least bishop of the church at Exham in 710, so at least in a subordinate position to the broader metropolitic one. Theodore died himself in 690, so having transformed the English church significantly since he took charge 21 years before. He had succeeded in increasing the number of Anglo-Saxon bishops. As a consequence, we were hinting at before, succeeding in convening them in council, giving them a voice as a collective Anglo-Saxon church, and established an exceptional school at his episcopal see as well, which owed much also to his Levantine origin, and especially the specifically Antiochian theological background that he was a member of. Right? Briefly, say in the 7th century, Antiochian theology, before here again, the guy had witnessed the Islamic takeover of his land, etc. But up to that point, as you know, Antioch was not just one of the great metropolitic sees of the Christian world, but in fact a see of Hellenistic culture, and one that was tendentially more aligned with Constantinople compared to the sort of less orthodox Egyptian south that was also in fact the more welcoming with the Arabs. Antiochian theology was still echoing through the Christian world even after the Islamic takeover. In fact, a Christian church, as you know, remained, right? And this is true throughout all the following centuries. The Antiochian voice was now part of the broader chorus shaped by the earlier councils like Chalcedon, and its theology was born from the local school of Antioch, known for its literal interpretation of the Bible, contrasting with Alexander's allegorical approach. In Christology, it emphasized Christ's human and divine natures, distinctly leading to controversies like that of Nestorius, whose teachings were condemned, but whose ideas continued to resonate in the Church of the East. By this time, Antiochian thoughts on Christology had melded somewhat with Chalcedonian orthodoxy anyway, focusing on one person in two natures. Right, so this was the case of the same Theodore that would have been, of course, an Orthodox, and learn the difference between the Orthodox. Say, the Orthodox Church doesn't even exist. All right, the Orthodox Church official name is Catholic because the only name of the Church is Catholic. Right? If you still don't understand what these two terms mean, out of the dumb 20th century conceptualization of this different areas of culture as they have been also defined, you can't go very far in history of religions, not just in the one of Christianity. This school of Theodore trained bishops would later occupy sees as important as the one of Wessex, Northumbria, and among the which as well, this was another peripheral polity in the West, in the Celtic fringe, as a reminder to the latter that the Roman Catholic and also Anglo-Saxon Church in its entirety had won, right? This is very important from a civilizational point of view and also for the development of English identity. Theodore's efforts also had included implementing a series of rulings that elevated the discipline of the laity, as is evident in his penitential. I made a couple of videos about early medieval penitentials. They're incredibly beautiful because they give, especially in the Latin Germanic world, this very concrete material sense of how much really among this still relatively fragmented world, the average layman was a warrior, was a commander, was a fighter, had to pay in order for shedding blood, which was not, again, forbidden in an absolute earthly sense, was just condemned in a spiritual, by spiritual standards, and essentially you could kill, but then you had to expiate for this sin that was taken extremely seriously by the people involved. I mean, people have sometimes this notion that Christianity, they have a great cognitive dissonance. Like half of the people, even who follow me, I suspect, believe that this channel is, I don't know, some kind of against the church or something, that the church is a Jewish byproduct that was imposed on the superior Aryans, and that it was did not belong to the broader spiritual temper of the time. First of all, like, I understand that, again, nobody studies history of religion. People have no idea why even Christianity happened at large. They have all the fantasy version of how or why this happened. I don't even want to go too deep into this, but the fact that these people would be, say, even without that overarching authority, like, I don't know, in Constantinople, that could simply even want at least to kill would kill popes, would subject the church to dominate, etc., could be demanded, would be extremely disciplined as far as this penitence and general understanding of the importance of the sacred and why bloodshed is a sin, but also how it's necessary to some earthly. It's not really necessary in absolute terms, but it must be enforced sometimes by a human earthly degree that requires that kind of regulation and discipline. And how in these places where you would think that, again, people were without authority, they did whatever they wanted because they were free and pure, actually they stuck to the Christian discipline, and they were incredibly to the point of that. We simply know it because this was negotiated. Like, the type of penitence that was provided could seem, well, not even so lenient, but it was so precise and so much calibrated also from a penitentiary to another in different regions of Europe, that you understand how this was the fruit of a specific negotiation and of a specific meaning that of course reflected the broader Catholic traditional beliefs existing also before Christianity regarding bloodshed and what was the entire point of divine transfiguration. I made a bit about the Comitatus that can explain all of this, also especially in pre-Christian times. and that were actually obeyed, right? Were followed by these otherwise sort of stateless individuals that listened, however, to the church, that was that relevantly fundamental in the check and balancement of temporal authority. The same, in fact, Anglo-Saxon laymen were incredibly, as we know, also in the later centuries and millennium, but very attentive too. Like the idea of tyranny, of course, it would mostly develop from later times, but you can argue that the development of the Anglo-Saxon, of the English identity from a Romano-Germanic background is also filtered through this collective understanding of the negotiation of authority that still informs common law and represents one of the purest providential visions of the Anglo-Saxon people, that is also a great part of the reason why this people was so historically successful, right? And you know that, and the more I studied English history, the more I loved it in this direction, which I honestly never heard. I mean, there is a sort of poetry, a sort of sophistication in the way English history is narrated, and it stems exactly from these centuries. Of course, great part of this was bent by some sort of liberal, but not leftistic rejection and refusal of tradition. But when you actually recover the latter and you spouse it with that English sensitivity and artistical beauty in its broader political, military, and social expression, you really understand how precious, powerful, and fully European at every level Anglo-Saxon identity really was, right? And it's so relevant, and what here the evangelization did was declined in the same ways that this people's spirit would express, which is really nothing short of extraordinary, right? Because if you consider also the past of the Anglo-Saxon people, you realize how up to this point, they had, I mean, the moment they settled in Britain, they were barely civilized, and yet they managed to set these standards. And again, of course, amidst blood and issues and fragmentation, there is no doubt, but still, also because of that, it's as if they had learned the lesson. It's as if they had understood the value of that balance that other countries were sort of given a bit more for granted. Now, most importantly, Theodore of Tarsus created this singular archbishop with clear authority over the entire English church. We understood. This is the third time I say it. Gregory the Great was named as his patron because of the obvious, almost fatherly connection that he had with the English, since his anecdotal observation of their angelic features in Rome. And in doing so, and this is deep, right? It's not just merely anecdotal. In doing so, Theodore not just honored the memory of such giant of the church, but he also transformed the success of the Roman mission in the position of Canterbury, which largely maintained its prominence even after a metropolitan see, was eventually established at York in 735. But of course, never reaching the level of spiritual superiority that Canterbury had. Consider that this is very relevant in as much as still at this point, of course, the Christendom in general was distant from the notion of a single center. Like it's also the times. The early Middle Ages would make it relatively understandable. Rome had the primacy of charity and of honor. It was, as we've seen, recognized as the true only spirit and ghost and force of the West by everybody involved. But of course, the riches of this churches was relatively limited to certain regional scopes. This, of course, enhances dramatically, in perspective, the value of what Rome did, which was truly ecumenic in nature. But it's not like Rome here is just concentrated on the West. It's also, at this point, more connected with the East to a degree, even though it has taken an ever more Italic, Central Italian physiognomy. The point is that the empire was ideally still one and there, right? Even in the West, and aside from Constantinople, right? And I made a video about, I will post surely in the link down below, in the top fixed comment, regarding the metaphysical reason of why the Papal States would be emerging during this time, which is a different, of course it can't be but metaphysical, because it does not belong to an earthly domain, right? This is the other point. This is valid for the entire church, right? But the fact that there is an hegemonic, charismatic, and universally recognized center, spirit of each national church in a single diocese is very much still a hallmark of Western civilization and European history and identity. The canonization and legacy of Cuthbert, Bishop of Lindisfarne, who served from 685 to 687, also illustrates the resolution achieved following the disputes at Whitby. Cuthbert was an ascetic nurtured in the Ionan tradition, that again was incredibly strong, brutal, severe, harsh, physically torturous in practice, and incredibly hard, right, just to follow. Even in the Anglo-Saxon source of it, in Ireland, it was worse. I mean, this is also we think a lot about the Gaelic influence in Christian spirituality at this time, but the Anglo-Saxon version of it is perhaps underplayed. Cuthbert adhered to the Roman Easter, right? He followed the Roman insight into the Easter controversy that also in Ireland, as we've seen in my video, witnessed that kind of factionalism for which some Irish monks sided with Rome, of course, and others not. And after his death, for this reason, Cuthbert was commemorated by both Lindisfarne and Bede as a model of the Hiberno-Gregorian monastic pastoral approach. So mixing that kind of Gaelic mysticism with Roman discipline, proving how well connected these two spiritual and also temporal approaches could be. Right? There is not just a merely mystical dimension, there is a secular one. And here you have the best of both traditions blending, showing that, in fact, a whole Roman unity was achievable across the entire British Isles. By the way, Cuthbert's opulent burial goods, including silk vestments, a gold and garnet pectoral cross, an iron comb, a small gospel book, and a silver-plated portable reliquary, indicate that while potentially not as lavish as Wilfrid's environment, that, as we've seen, had also been less celebrated after his death for his opposition against Theodore, his legacy was undoubtedly rich and luxurious. This also shows you how important and importantly wealthy the church already was, but how the burial sites could become, of course, seats of pilgrimage and of admiration of the power of the established church. This was a very important visual propaganda as well. The tombs were ever more illustrating the concrete power of the local church. In 698, Cuthbert's incorruptible remains, thus exemplifying a veritable relic, were translated following newly established ceremonial practices from Gaul, further solidifying the new synthesis. If you're interested, I made a video about French pilgrimage and reliquaries that we will surely come back on, because it's an incredibly important topic, not just because of the different sort of hagiographic tradition existing in France at this time, but of course for the obvious influence that these would have in England, as much as the shared background that the vision of, say, the burial, the hero. I made some videos explaining the traditional meaning of resurrection and that, in fact, in that sense, had for these people. Remember all the Irish saints that had something suspiciously to do in that, and not suspiciously, because it was literally the same thing, with the previous heroes buried in Celtic mounds as warriors, etc., and the other warriors getting inspiration from that, from this numinous force that was beautifully still understood in relatively unspoiled ways, even in such a tendentially chthonic country like Ireland, that also had its Apollonian sparks in a way that other parts of Europe had relatively forgotten. Well, the Gaelic spirit theology, at least, it wasn't much of a different theology, at least they tried. Think about the Pelagian heresy starting back in the day, like, could be all these issues, but in different times now, heresies weren't quite a thing anymore. Late antiquity was slightly more vibrant intellectually, and heresies would come back in a later period in history, as you know. But bringing this new, at times heterodox, at times provocative, at times, as we've seen here, sort of recalcitrant behavior, but one that eventually would fully enter, like, the wake of, the Roman tradition. I mean, today Ireland is a Catholic country, still differently from England in a broader sense. So but this is another issue, of course, happening from realities that were almost 1 millennium away from the times that we are looking at, right? But if you want to understand the history of these countries, of these churches, you must make this important effort to appreciate really the veritable meaning hiding behind such words, such worldviews, and all that fundamentally they all fundamentally entailed, right? It's an incredibly important moment in Christian history, not just in English or British history. It really marks a very important different time and spiritual ghost and worldview compared to what we've mostly seen up to this point. It's incredibly important to get this story right? And again, English history is really amazing. I couldn't be happier to make these videos about the Anglo-Saxons. I think we make too few of them, telling the truth, and that's why I want to continue really hopefully soon. Like, it's English history is very I would say very well explored, of course, by British culture, historiography in general. But again, if there are some there is some bibliography could be useful to revive a bit the sense of old English tradition, and of course, looking at what happened before the Anglican schism, etc., and also what happened later with the attempt of coming back, at least some Catholicism that failed anyway. So that's another story. But England paradoxically could achieve this because it was not really a country like others, right? It was really special even in the negative of this, and there is definitely a broader meaning that I think is quite important for the world today to grasp from English history, for the obvious reasons of the consequentiality of such culture in the world. I don't remember how many videos I made on the Anglo-Saxons. Today, what I was recording actually was captured by another issue that I think, I don't want to be too harsh here, I will not say anything, but the Anglo-Saxons only 15 videos, too few, we must make much more. But I was saying I was captured by the possibility of a person actually stealing my content. And not quite stealing my content, but rephrasing it and selling it. And I'm now going to give a look at it. I don't know how to act in such occasions, because my content is serious. I make, say, my best in order to deliver it to you. And I believe that even when, say, you have these issues, like what kind of sources use, etc., like if you understand the criticism, if you understand the originality, if you understand the research behind that, like, that should be enough. But when there is an outright copy, and I understand that these things happen today, especially with artificial intelligence, etc., things become a bit more difficult. But just know that the internet is small, right? That lies have short legs, and the whole system is also orientatively tending much more than before towards an actual connection with the say, with an actual possibility of tracking this kind of incidents. So whoever is listening to my videos probably I think there is a great deal of support and of appreciation. I'm not complaining, but were I to find out that my scripts are copied, well, then we are gonna have a problem, because I'm not going to tolerate this, and I don't know what I will. If anything, I'm very benign. I wouldn't be such a pain in the behind on a regular basis, but the problem here being that if I voice the problem, I'm going to scare people off, and I'm also getting more views in the process. So I'm likely not going to strike anybody's content down unless there is some sort of serial issue with it, which I hope is not going to come. In any case, I will use this to make myself publicity rather than taking this vindicative stance. Nevertheless, I hope I will not have to do this. Again, the channel is going fairly well. I don't know what's now. Maybe it's Trump's wave that takes away a bit of views from the usual, but it's just maybe that because it's not the holidays anymore, I have slightly less views, but the channel is still expanding. As always, I want to thank anyone here, especially the members, people who share my content, also on Twitter. These contributions are amazing, and I thank you for that. If we manage to extend this to more people in an active sense, we're really riding the wave. We are on horseback, and we don't have to fear anything, really. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.